My husband was sneaking around with his girl best friend, and then she sent me a message saying she's pregnant with his child. The only problem in my marriage with my husband has always been his best friend, Mariana. When I found out that he was lying about working overtime to meet up with her, I was tempted to end everything. Of course, I thought they were having an affair, but I gave my husband the benefit of the doubt and decided to check their messages. Surprisingly, he didn't object to this. And when I looked through the messages, there was no sign of infidelity. The reason my husband was spending more time with Mariana recently was because the 5-year anniversary of her older sister's death was approaching. During this time, Mariana always became extremely depressed. This really calmed me down, and although I was hurt by the fact that my husband didn't tell me the truth about what he was doing, I could accept that he was just being a great friend. Some time passed, and things were fine until my husband invited me to Mariana's mother's birthday party. I agreed, and was actually quite excited because I wanted to make more female friends and have girls' nights out to relieve work stress. I figured I might meet some women there. I walked into the house with my husband, expecting a simple gathering. And then Mariana did something I had never seen her do before. In all the times that she, my husband, and I had met, she literally ran to him, happy, and immediately wrapped her whole body around his arm, dragging him off to the garden without even saying hello to me. My husband didn't even come back to get me or anything after being taken away. So, I went to the kitchen to ask for a drink, where I was greeted by Mariana's mother. She is a lovely person. We had a pleasant conversation about our lives, and she made sure I felt welcome. The whole event was mostly uneventful until dinner. I sat down next to my husband, and Mariana came up to me and asked me to move. I asked why, since the only other available seat was next to her uncle and mother. And considering it was her mother's birthday, wouldn't she want to sit beside her? Mariana simply replied, "Because I want to sit next to him." I turned to my husband hoping for support, but he completely caught me off guard. He just nodded and told me to move, saying I was being childish and making a fuss over seating. At that moment, I felt my blood boiling because it was so obvious what Mariana was doing, and my husband was just going along with it. I stood up, trying to stay composed, and told my husband that I was feeling uncomfortable and needed to go to the bathroom. I asked where it was, and Mariana pointed me in the right direction. I left the table and started doing breathing exercises to calm myself down. Once I was in the bathroom, I messaged my brother, explaining the situation. He told me I was being jealous and overreacting. Reluctantly, I agreed and went back to the table, choosing to sit next to Mariana's mother. The entire time, my husband and Mariana were laughing together as if everything he said was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. She kept rubbing his back, touching his arms, and commenting on how much stronger he had gotten, all while throwing smug glances in my direction. The final straw for me was when I put a piece of meat on my plate, and she said, "Are you really going to eat all of that?" I froze in embarrassment while my husband and Mariana laughed at what they apparently thought was a joke. Her mother, visibly uncomfortable, stood up for me, saying the comment was inappropriate and that guests should be treated with respect, but Mariana completely ignored her. Mariana is very pretty, slim, and works out regularly, so hearing that from her stung deeply. I got up from my chair, walked out the front door, and called my dad. I told him I needed him to pick me up and that I would explain everything in the car. When I got in, I broke down and told him everything that had happened. He told me I might be overreacting, but the situation did sound odd, and I was welcome to stay at his place for the time being. I thanked him and went back to our house. While I was trying to settle down, my phone was flooded with messages from my husband and Mariana. Reading them only made things worse. My husband accused me of ruining the dinner and said he was staying at her house for the night. Mariana's messages claimed that I had spoiled her evening with my victim behavior. I looked up the term, and it only fueled my anger because I realized she was the very definition of someone who constantly seeks attention and validation. My husband came home around 5 p.m. from Mariana's, and I immediately told him that leaving his wife to stay at another woman's house was disgusting. He started shouting, saying I was overreacting again and that I needed therapy to deal with my jealousy issues. For about a month, my husband became more distant and cold, and I could feel that our argument had driven a wedge into our marriage. Things were clearly going downhill, and although we weren't having outright arguments, the tension in the house was palpable. We barely spoke, there was no intimacy between us, and I had to endure him running off to Mariana's house about once a week. I bit my tongue and held out hope, convincing myself this was just a phase in our marriage and that there would eventually be a light at the end of the tunnel. That hope shattered when I received a message from Mariana with a positive pregnancy test and a threat, saying we should get divorced because the baby was my husband's. I completely froze, utterly clueless about how to react. That evening, my husband came home around 6 p.m., threw his keys on the counter, and went upstairs without saying a word to me. I thought this was extremely rude, so I followed him upstairs, telling him we needed to talk. He dismissed me, saying he was tired and needed to sleep, which only fueled my anger because I was being serious. By this point, I was on the verge of tears, feeling entirely neglected, but I managed to hold them back for the moment. Halfway up the stairs, I told him I knew about him and Mariana. I expected him to look shocked, like a deer caught in headlights, but to my surprise, he looked at me confused. I explained my side, showed him the text and what it all seemed like. To my astonishment, he laughed in my face. That laugh filled me with so much rage. I had had enough of being walked all over. I shoved past him into our bedroom, grabbed a suitcase from under the bed, and started packing his things for him. He began shouting horrible things at me, but I barely heard any of it because I was crying uncontrollably, shoving every piece of his clothing into the suitcase as fast as I could. When I finished shoving the last pieces of his clothes into the suitcase, my heart was on fire. Not with love, but with pure indignation. He kept shouting behind me, hurling insults and accusations that I barely registered because the sound of my own sobs drowned him out. I yanked the zipper shut, turned to him, and pointed to the door. "Get out. Now." My voice trembled, but the message was crystal clear. He stared at me, incredulous, and for a moment, I thought he'd comply. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh and crossed his arms. "Do you really think you're going to kick me out that easily? This house is as much mine as it is yours. You can't just get rid of me," he said with an arrogance that only fueled my anger further. I took a deep breath, trying to hold onto what little composure I had left. I didn't want to fight anymore. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. I just wanted him gone. I don't want to argue. You know what you did. You know how much you've hurt me, and all I want now is for you to leave. Go to Mariana's. She seems more than happy to take you in, I said, trying to keep my tone firm, even though my insides were shaking. He looked at me with that smug grin of his that made me want to throw the suitcase at his face. "Mariana? You think this is her fault? Maybe if you weren't so insecure and paranoid, things would have been fine between us," he said, and his words cut deeper than I expected. It felt like he'd slapped me with an invisible hand. Not only was he minimizing everything he'd done, but he was also blaming me for his selfish, disgusting choices. The rage surged again, like an unstoppable wave. "Insecure? Paranoid? You lie. You spend nights at another woman's house, and I get a message from her saying she's pregnant with your child, and I'm the paranoid one?" My voice rose, raw with emotion. "Don't you dare blame me for your selfish, despicable behavior." He didn't respond, but his smirk faded. I pointed to the door again. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call my dad and the police." And I'm not joking. That seemed to rattle him. He grabbed the suitcase with a sharp movement, but before he stepped out, he stopped at the door and said something I'll never forget. "You're going to regret this. Kicking me out." "I won't forget it." The threat lingered in the air as he slammed the door behind him. I collapsed to the floor, crying, a mix of relief and despair flooding me. As much as I wanted to believe it was over, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. My dad insisted that I stay with him for a while, but I decided to stay in my house. It was my space, my life, and I wasn't going to let him take that from me. Still, I couldn't sleep at night. Every creak of the house made me think he might come back, furious, demanding to get in. A week later, I received a message from Mariana. My heart pounded before I even opened it. I didn't want to read it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message read, "I hope you're happy. Now he's with me, where he's always belonged. Enjoy your loneliness." The rage returned with full force, but this time, it was accompanied by something darker. The determination not to let them win. I blocked her number without replying and started thinking about everything I needed to do to protect myself. I contacted a lawyer and started the divorce process, knowing full well that he'd likely make it as difficult as possible. A few days later, I received a notification that he had filed to contest the division of assets. He wanted half of the house, claiming he had contributed financially. That was the last straw. The man who had betrayed, humiliated, and destroyed my trust now wanted to take what little I had left. I decided to fight. I hired the best lawyer I could afford and began gathering every piece of evidence I had against him. Messages, photos, witnesses. Everything. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to get through this with my dignity intact, even if it meant exposing all his dirt in court. Meanwhile, things got stranger. Mutual friends started messaging me, saying he was spreading rumors about me, trying to paint me as the villain. He claimed I was controlling, that I wouldn't let him be happy, that the divorce was all my fault. The public humiliation was almost unbearable, but I refused to respond. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me stoop to his level. At the first divorce hearing, he showed up hand in hand with Mariana, parading her like a trophy. My stomach churned, but I kept my composure. Throughout the session, he and his lawyer tried to discredit me, but mine was prepared. We started presenting the evidence we'd gathered, and little by little, his smug grin faded. Still, the battle was far from over. As we left the courtroom, he gave me a look that sent a chill down my spine. "This isn't over. You'll pay for all of this," he muttered before walking away with Mariana. The sense of danger lingered in the air. I knew he still had tricks up his sleeve and wasn't going to back down easily. But one thing was certain. Neither would I. After months of legal battles, the divorce was finally finalized. I managed to secure half of the assets, including the house, which was my main priority. It was a bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. My ex-husband and Mariana didn't make it easy, dragging out the process and trying to humiliate me at every turn. When I signed the final papers, I swore that chapter of my life was closed. I wanted to move on and never look back. During the divorce, Mariana continued flaunting her pregnancy as if it were a trophy, showing up to hearings with her growing belly. My ex seemed proud, as if he was embarking on a new phase of his life. Every time he looked at me, it was as if he wanted to provoke me, but I kept my head high. It was hard, but knowing I was free from that toxic relationship helped me move forward. A few months later, I heard through mutual friends that Mariana had given birth to a baby boy. My ex was ecstatic, posting pictures on social media as if his life was perfect. I'll admit, seeing it still stung. Not because I wanted him back, but because the public humiliation I'd endured was still a fresh wound. Still, I did my best to ignore it. That was no longer my life. What I didn't expect was that, over time, their perfect life would start to crumble. One day, while leaving a local grocery store, I ran into an old friend who still kept in touch with people from our old social circle. She looked hesitant but finally said, "Did you hear what happened between your ex and Mariana?" I shook my head, curious but cautious. I didn't want details, but something in her tone piqued my interest. "They're fighting a lot. Apparently, he found messages between her and another guy, pretty explicit stuff," she said in a hushed voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. "And there are rumors that the baby might not even be his." My mind raced. Messages, infidelity, the possibility that the baby wasn't his. It all seemed so surreal, I didn't know what to think. I quickly said goodbye and went home, trying to push the conversation out of my head. After all, their chaos was no longer my problem. Or so I thought. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected message from my ex. He wanted to meet to talk. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something told me there was more to it. I agreed to meet him at a public cafe, where he showed up visibly shaken. His eyes were sunken, and he looked like he'd aged years since I last saw him. "Mariana cheated on me," he started bluntly, staring down at his coffee. "I found messages between her and another guy while she was pregnant." I stayed silent, letting him continue. He seemed like he needed to get it off his chest. I confronted her, asked if the baby was mine, and you know what she said? He let out a bitter, almost desperate laugh. She said no, that the baby belongs to the other guy. I was stunned. Even though I'd cut all emotional ties with him, I never thought Mariana would do something like this. They had destroyed my marriage to be together, and now she was stabbing him in the back. "So, what are you going to do?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shook his head, exhaling deeply. "I don't know. I did a paternity test and she was right. The baby isn't mine. But now she's filed a lawsuit. She's asking for socio-emotional child support." My eyes widened in shock. "What?" "She wants child support from you, for a baby that isn't even yours." "Exactly. Her lawyer says that since I took on the role of father for the first few months, I have an emotional responsibility to the child." It was so absurd I almost laughed, but the devastated look on his face stopped me. Months passed, and the case went to court. Mariana, ever the manipulator, presented evidence that my ex had been a father figure during the baby's early months, even if it was for a short time. She argued that he had created a bond with the child and, therefore, had a financial obligation. To my complete disbelief, the judge agreed and ruled that he had to pay monthly support. The news spread quickly. My ex was devastated, and Mariana carried on with her life as if nothing had happened, seemingly without remorse. Even though I had no connection to him anymore, I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and a small amount of ironic satisfaction. He had destroyed our marriage to be with her, and now he was trapped in an even more humiliating and unjust situation. Deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Mariana wasn't the kind of person to pass up an opportunity to manipulate, and my ex, despite everything, still seemed vulnerable to her schemes. As for me, I just wanted to stay as far away from their chaos as possible. But a part of me couldn't help but watch from a distance, waiting to see how it would all unfold. After all, what would Mariana do next? And more importantly, what would he do when he finally realized that his choices had led him down a path of no return? Honestly, that wasn't my problem anymore. He and Mariana had made their choices, destroyed my marriage, and humiliated me publicly to live their so-called perfect life, which was now falling apart. He was paying the price for the decisions he made, and frankly, I couldn't feel sorry for him. Every step he took seemed to drag him further into the hole he had dug for himself. As he finished venting about the court's decision and his anger with Mariana, I just looked at him unmoved. The tears in his eyes, the defeated tone of his voice, none of it stirred anything in me. It felt like watching a soap opera with an ending I already knew. When he finally paused, expecting some kind of sympathy or response from me, I took a deep breath and decided to be honest. You know, I could pretend to feel bad for you, but the truth is you're getting exactly what you deserve. He looked up at me, shocked, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. When you decided to cheat on me, lie to me, and leave me for Mariana, you knew exactly what you were doing. You destroyed our marriage for someone who clearly never had any morals, and now you're surprised she's done the same to you? Sorry, but I don't feel bad for you. He tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand to stop him. And before you say I'm being cold or vindictive, let me make something very clear. I've moved on. The mess you're in now doesn't affect me anymore, and frankly, if I have anything to say about it, it never will. I stood up, adjusted my bag on my shoulder, and gave him one last look. You got what you deserved. And you know what? I hope this is a lesson for you. Not for my sake, but for yours, because if you keep going like this won't be the last time your life turns into a disaster. I walked out of the cafe without looking back. Every step I took made me feel lighter, as if I was finally shedding the last remnants of the weight of that relationship. The past was where it belonged. In the past. At that moment, I decided that from now on, my life would be mine alone. There would be no room for chaos or for the consequences of other people's bad decisions. I was finally ready to write my own ending, far away from betrayal, manipulation, and regret. As for him and Mariana, well, they could keep living in the mess they created. It wasn't my problem anymore.